on this POW camp. And so I was just amazed. And come to find out that, in the days after the camp, after the war, the camp was totally dismantled, the buildings were sold off, right? And it was returned to farmland. And this community did not want to recover this memory. They did not want to be remembered for being the site of this camp. The reason for this is because in the closing days of the Civil War, the big controversy swirling around the North was about Andersonville. Andersonville was a POW camp in deep southern Georgia, more than 100 miles south of Atlanta. It was the worst of the POW camps. This was a Confederate-run POW camp. It's going to hold more than 40,000 Union soldiers. A camp that was designed to hold not more than 10,000. And as the war winds down, the northern public comes to learn about the atrocities at Andersonville. Some of this is because there were some escapees that made their way to Sherman's army while he was marching through Georgia. Some of this trickled in through other ways. And then when the camp was finally liberated at the end of the war, and pictures began to be drawn of the condition of these prisoners, the stories began to circulate, the North was up in arms over what happened at Andersonville and the condition of these Union soldiers that had to try to live through this experience. Many of them did not. The casualty rate was 30%, the highest of any POW camp, we believe. And so while the North was up in arms over Andersonville, you also have to remember that Lee had surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia. The war was essentially over, and the South was humiliated. Their pride was wounded. They were not feeling good about this in any way. And, at this very moment, the North piles on with complaints about Andersonville. And so the South is on the defensive. And their answer is, what about Hellmira? And this is a refrain that you're going to hear over and over. Every time the North complains about Andersonville, the South is going to respond, what about Hellmira? What about Hellmira? Well, the people of Hellmira did not like this parallel at all. They did not want to be equated with Andersonville in any way. And this conversation goes on for 30 years after the war, during Reconstruction, on and on and on. And so here's a community that wanted to forget its past. And the first book to come out about the Hellmira camp comes out right before World War I by a man by the name of Clay Holmes. And his book was pretty good. It was written based on eyewitness accounts and memoirs of participants. But that was the first. And that was the only book dedicated to what happened in Hellmira down until the 1990s, when two books came out at about the same time. It wasn't until the 1990s that this community began to embrace its past. The first monument went up in the 1990s as the result of a high school project. They placed this monument on the grounds of where the camp was, but you had to know where it was in order to see it. There were no historical markers yet, and so you had to be familiar with the neighborhood because it was kind of back near an old waterworks building. And if you didn't know about it, it would be easy to miss. Even during the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary, they really were not embracing this fully. It was only after that that a group was formed, a nonprofit formed called the Friends of Hellmira Prison, who wanted to try to remember this in a more meaningful way. And among the things that this group did was to pull out of storage an original camp building and rebuild it. Again, very near where this monument is. I thought this was just a rumor, but this group did it. When they reconstructed it, they had probably 70% original lumber still that survived. A lot of the hardware was original, and they rebuilt this building there. And then later, they reconstructed a barracks that these prisoners would have lived in using schematics that they found in Washington in the War Department. So it's very historically accurate. So if you go to this site today, you can see the reconstructed building in this barracks and get a better sense of how these men lived. But this is all very recent, very recent. Another, you can advance it because I can't see that. Another reason that this is significant to me is because of this man. So I learned about 15 years ago, I think it was, that I had a great-grandfather. Well, I have 6 that served in the war total, but this particular great-grandfather I learned about then. I discovered that he fought at Gettysburg. He was wounded on the first day out on the Chambersburg Pike, not far from where General John Reynolds was killed. And he was wounded either in the neck or in the knee. The documents disagree on this point. But in any case, he was wounded but survived. But he was never able to go back to combat duty. And so he joined what was called the Invalid Corps, or more politically correct term is the Veterans Reserve Corps. So this is a group of men that are wounded or incapacitated in some way that still want to serve their country in whatever way they can. And then I learned several years after this that he was transferred to Hellmira, where he may have guarded the very prisoners his great-grandson would then write about much later. So when you have a connection like that, it makes it very personal, right? You can go on, thank you. So let's start the story of the POW camp in the North, the construction of these, and then we'll move toward talking about Hellmira proper. When the Civil War started, both sides thought that this was going to be a short, bloodless war. Both sides thought there'll be one battle, maybe, it'll be relatively bloodless. God was on their side, of course, and so that side would win. And there was so much of this romantic talk going into the war that drove men into the ranks, you know. I know that one congressman, Leroy Walker from Alabama, said on the floor of Congress there'd be so little bloodshed in this war that he would be able to mop it up with his pocket handkerchief. And a congressman beside him said, well, I'd be willing to drink it. So this is what they're thinking when this all gets underway. And so as a result, you know, they don't plan for things like an ambulance corps or medical corps or POW facilities of any kind, really. There was just not planning because they thought it was going to be short on this. It was this man, Montgomery Meigs, that first brought it up in the War Department. Now, if you're not familiar with this guy is one of the big unsung heroes of the Union war effort. He's the quartermaster general. He's the guy that was in charge of feeding the armies, clothing the armies, supplying all the armies. And while there was a lot of rotation in jobs during the Civil War, this guy stayed in the same job the whole war because he was so good at it. He was so very competent. And yet we don't remember him for his contributions, unfortunately. He went to the Secretary of War after the Battle of Bull Run, and he said, you know what? We should give some thought to the exchange of prisoners and to POW facilities in general. And Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War at the time, was more interested in lining his own pockets than he was in anything else. So he didn't want to hear about this. But Meigs went on his own, quietly planning behind the scenes, and it's a good thing he did, because it meant that there were some things already in place when the emergency comes. We can go to the next one. So one of the things that Meigs does is he hires this guy, William Hoffman, to be the Commissary General of Prisoners for the Union. So he is going to be in charge of whatever POW facilities are started. Now, one of the arguments that I make in my book is that neither side did this properly. Neither side planned this well, and really both sides are going to end up winging it. And this leads ultimately to a humanitarian disaster, north and south. Here is evidence for how unprepared and how poorly this was planned. This guy only got the job because he happened to be unemployed at the time, and he happened to be in Washington. Now, I'm not saying that this guy wasn't a good soldier. He was. He earned distinction in battle early in the war, out in Texas. He himself was a POW for a time. And the reason he was in Washington is being an officer. Officers weren't generally incarcerated as POWs at this time. And so he was kind of unofficially on leave awaiting exchange in Washington when he was at the War Department. And Hoffman says, well, what's your next assignment? Or I'm sorry, Meigs says to Hoffman, what is your next assignment? And Hoffman says, I don't have one right now. I'm waiting to be exchanged. You know what? I have a job for you. And that's how he got the job. Not because he was qualified, not because he had any administrative experience to speak of. He just happened to be there at the moment, and he was an officer. If they were really concerned about this, they would have hired somebody with some administrative experience and a better background in this. Another problem with Hoffman is he's a skinflint, and this is going to translate to how the prisoners themselves are treated ultimately. The War Department famously did not want to spend money, and they especially did not want to spend money on the POW problem. And so Hoffman, being kind of a cheap man by nature, at least fit what the War Department wanted here. Unfortunately, that's going to mean suffering among the prisoners later. This is the Confederate version. The Confederate Army never appointed a commissary general of prisoners. What they did was they gave the problem to the provost marshal of Richmond. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and the provost marshal is in charge of keeping order. One day he was basically told by Jefferson Davis, oh, and also, you're going to be in charge of any POWs that we keep. And through most of the war, POWs held by the Confederacy were held in Richmond prisons, either at Libby or on Belle Isle, but generally in the Richmond area. It won't be until the very end of the war that Winter will get the job more formally. So the emergency comes in 1862 after the Battle of Shiloh. So the Battle of Shiloh, this is the first big battle of the Civil War. It takes place in Tennessee near the Mississippi border. It was fought over 2 days and produces over 23,000 casualties. Over 23,000 casualties. When you compare this to, say, the casualties of Bull Run, which were just a few thousand, this was astronomical, right? And the country, north and south, is going to be horrified by the bloodbath here in this wilderness. And it was in the middle of nowhere. So when this battle was over, you have got big, big problems because the field is covered with the dead and wounded. The Confederates have it a little bit better in that those that they can take with them are going back to Corinth, only 25 miles away, and Corinth was a major railroad hub. But when the battle was over, the Confederates left a lot of their dead on the field, and the Union ended up having to deal with the problem. Because this is in the middle of nowhere, the Union has to transport the wounded that can be moved north on steamboats to places like Cairo, which is more than 500 miles upstream. And then you got the POWs, your prisoners. You're going to have to move them upstream by steamboat too. Well, we had no POW facilities at all yet. None. So what's going to happen is they're going to be sent upriver. The telegraph lines are going to be alive with warnings. Somebody up there better get ready. We have hundreds and thousands of prisoners on the way, and so they're going to convert old fairgrounds. They're going to use condemned penitentiaries. They're going to use old prison facilities, just whatever they can in this emergency. But what this means is they're winging it. They don't have the logistics in place to feed these men properly once they get there. And again, this is going to lead to a lot of suffering. Another thing that is part of the story is the exchange of prisoners. Because both sides would much rather exchange prisoners than to hold prisoners. Because holding prisoners can get expensive, especially if you have to do things like feed them, And so in previous wars, going back to the Napoleonic Wars, there was a kind of formula for the exchange of prisoners, right? Privates are easy. It's just one private for one private. But there are formulas for it'd be 10 privates maybe for a major, and for a brigadier general, it's 100 privates, things like that, right? And a new system, a new compromise needed to be reached about how this would be done during the Civil War. The problem with this is that Abraham Lincoln did not want to negotiate with Confederate agents because he did not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government. Secession to Abraham Lincoln was illegal, therefore the Confederacy did not exist. Simply, these are men in rebellion against national authority. To sit down and negotiate with them would be equivalent to recognizing them, right? And so this was a big problem for a time. And ultimately, pragmatically, he had to kind of give in and make these negotiations military in nature, not political in nature. So it was officers of the two armies that met, and they worked out something called the Dix Hill Cartel, which was a system of exchange that went into effect, and the POW camps on both sides, these jury-rigged things, began to empty out. Good. It seems like we've got a handle on the problem now with this cartel. Until the Emancipation Proclamation screwed it all up. So the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln in January 1863. This is a document much misunderstood. When I ask my students when I'm teaching the Civil War, what is the Emancipation Proclamation? Often I get, that is what freed the slaves. The answer to that is a hard no. No, when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, it freed no slaves at all. None. The Emancipation Proclamation is a highly symbolic document. It's a very strange document made for very particular reasons. It's not a law. It's not an amendment. It's a war order issued by the commander-in-chief, and it's highly symbolic. What it really says is the slaves held in the states then in rebellion against national authority are then and forever free. But you just said, Professor, it didn't free any slaves. Right. Hold on. So it said slaves in the states in rebellion are free. In the very place where he's got no control. In the very place where he can't make it happen. Right? He's not in control of those territories at the moment, and therefore nobody's free. It's more like a promise of freedom, ultimately. And what it really does is it changes the nature of the war. All of a sudden, the war now is about freeing men, not just preserving the Union. And that was significant because it's going to close the door to any interference by Great Britain, who had been making noise about recognizing the Confederacy because Great Britain needed the Confederacy's cotton really bad. But by changing the nature of the war about freeing men, it also opened the door to the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. And thousands are going to join the Union Army. By the end of the Civil War, over 200,000 African Americans will have fought for their own freedom. That leads to another problem. When these men are captured in battle, the Confederacy refuses to exchange African American prisoners. Utterly refuses. So this is a quote from James Seth, Secretary of War for the Confederacy. Black soldiers cannot be recognized in any way as soldiers subject to the rules of war. They utterly refuse to exchange African American soldiers on the same basis of white soldiers. Well, this is a problem. And Lincoln and the War Department say, well, look, if you are not going to exchange African American soldiers the same as white soldiers, we're going to stop exchanging entirely. And the whole Dix Hill cartel breaks down. It breaks down. Now, I should pause here and also say that not many African American soldiers lived to get into incarceration in a POW camp. Many times, African American soldiers were killed instead of taken prisoner. Some, even in the act of surrender, are bayoneted or shot. And so very few African American soldiers ever make it into a POW camp in any case. That's just the sad part of the story. So now the system has broken down. Now, fast forward to 1864. So in 1864, the military situation has changed. Early in the war, and one of the reasons the Emancipation Proclamation came about, is things looked really bad for the Union. The first year and a half or 2 years of the war looked really bad. Lincoln could not find competent generals. Union armies were getting their butts kicked left and right. Situation looked really grim. But in the summer of '63, two things happened that really began to turn things around. The Battle of Gettysburg, 3-day battle in early July that's going to produce over 50,000 casualties over 3 days. And then the day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi surrenders to Ulyssess Grant. Two fantastic Union victories back to back, both of them very strategically important. So in boxing, this would be like a 1-2 punch, right? One to the gut, one to the jaw. And historians believe that after these twin Union victories, the Confederacy really could not win this war. So the tide begins to turn. In 1864, Ulyssess S. Grant gets promoted to become general of all Union armies. He had been out in the West fighting. He's brought east. And now he's going to make his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac, and he is going to guide the strategy of the Union's largest army with the target of capturing Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And so in the spring of '64, the Overland Campaign kicks into gear. The Overland Campaign is going to be essentially 6 weeks of continuous battle as Union armies advance on the Confederate capital, and this is going to produce enormous bloodshed. By the time that those 6 weeks are over, the Union Army will have lost nearly 60,000 men, the equivalent of a whole army. This is one of the reasons that Grant is still called the Butcher in the history books, because he knew, as Lincoln knew, that losing a battle doesn't matter for the Union. You just need to keep fighting, because the Confederacy by this time could not replace its fallen men. Every man lost in the Confederate Army could not be replaced. Therefore, Confederate armies can only get smaller. And that was the key. Lincoln called it the arithmetic. That is why Grant just kept fighting. Win, lose, or draw, just keep fighting, because Confederate armies can only get smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, if you are going at it this way, in this headlong, frontal assault manner, where you're just going to keep fighting, of course, this is going to produce not only mass casualties, but a lot of prisoners on both sides. And so, in anticipation of this campaign, a new POW camp was started at Point Lookout, Maryland. They knew that they were going to need this for the spring campaign. The POW camps were already kind of bursting at the seams. They had to be opening new ones. Point Lookout was designed to hold 20,000. It's going to hold more than 40,000 ultimately. This was kind of a common story. You're going to more than double your capacity out of necessity. Point Lookout was actually well situated as so far as POW camps were concerned. They chose Point Lookout because the infrastructure and the logistics were already in place. Here on the point, you can see the Hammond General Hospital. Kind of looks like the spokes on a wheel. The Hammond General Hospital is the Union's largest military hospital. And this had been here for some time. Of course, during the Overland Campaign, that too is going to get really crowded. But all of the piers, all of the supply systems were in place for the hospital. And so they put a POW camp here on this peninsula as well, because they don't have to really invent the infrastructure, it's already there. Peninsulas and islands, by the way, make good places for POW camps because it's hard to escape from. And so this made sense too. This is going to be the primary feeder camp for Hellmira. 95% of the prisoners sent to Hellmira first were incarcerated at Point Lookout. So, and one more, please. By this time, Andersonville was a going concern. Andersonville was created because during the Overland Campaign, the Confederate authorities knew that Grant was coming for Richmond. And so they decided to move all the POWs that were in the Richmond area elsewhere to get them out of the way of roaming Union cavalry that might try to free these men. And so they decide on deep southern Georgia. And so all of these Union captives are sent to deep southern Georgia, more than 100 miles south of Atlanta. The problem with this is they put it so far out of the way that they could not even feed their own guards at Andersonville, much less feed the prisoners in their charge. They created a huge supply problem for themselves that's only going to get worse over time. So it's a growing concern, and Union authorities very soon start to hear rumors about what's happening in Georgia. And that's going to affect their decision making. Why? So, and one more, please. Grant was really in a tough spot at this time because he was under enormous pressure by the Union public to exchange prisoners. Because rumors were getting to the North about the condition of their loved ones, and not only in the Richmond camps, but there was a major POW camp in Salisbury, North Carolina, that might have actually had a higher casualty rate than Andersonville, but conveniently all the records were destroyed. We know that it was a very large camp and the conditions were bad, but I have a theory that the casualty rate might have exceeded Andersonville. In any case, when the people of the North hear about this, they want prisoners exchanged. They don't want their men held. So Grant is under this enormous pressure, but he refuses, utterly refuses, by arguing, look, every Confederate soldier we release is going to go right back into Lee's army, and that makes another enemy against us. And so while it's hard on our men, he says, it's kind of a blessing to those that are in the ranks of the Union Army that these men are held, even if it's hard on our boys. And so he's going to stick to that. Why? So why Hellmira? Finally, we get to Hellmira. You have to have the backstory, though. Hellmira had been part of the Union war effort from the very beginning. In fact, when the war first started, New York State made Hellmira a training ground, and a transportation hub for soldiers on their way to the Union Army. This made a lot of sense. Hellmira was on several major railroad lines. There were more than one canal in the area, and it was convenient to kind of a gateway to the south. And so most Union soldiers from Western New York, Central New York, Southern Tier are all going to pass through Hellmira on their way south. Many will be mustered in the Army in Hellmira. Many will get their basic training in Hellmira. And so the infrastructure was here in Hellmira because of this, right? And so the federal government took over the facilities, began building barracks and kind of building out more infrastructure here. And as the war went on, this transitioned ultimately into a draft rendezvous as well. So when we had to resort to the draft, we also filtered those men through Hellmira as well. But by the time we get to 1864, and all the POW camps, including Point Lookout, are now bursting at the seams, they're looking for new facilities. Well, Hellmira is emptied out, not in use at the moment, really. There's a garrison here, and that's about it. But we got all this infrastructure in place. It just makes sense. There's already some barracks here. The railroad lines are here, so it's convenient for transportation. To the War Department, it was a no-brainer. The only possible drawback here is the climate, right? It's really cold in Hellmira in the wintertime. Their thought was, it's not going to be a problem because the war is going to be over before winter anyway, and so they're not going to have to deal with this. So this is why they chose Hellmira. Now, the commander in Hellmira, the post commander, was Seth Eastman. He is a career Army man, and he is not up to this job at all. He is on the edge of retirement. Although he's a career Army officer, his real interest is art. He's a very talented painter and sculptor, and that's really how he would like to spend his time, you know. And so he's got easy duty here in Hellmira until the War Department comes calling. They say, hey, we want to put a POW camp there. Now, he's a career Army officer, so his answer is going to be, yes, sir. Whatever you say, sir, right? Like, okay, so choose a place. So, all right, camp number 3 would be best, right on the Chemung River. It can probably hold 2,500, maybe 5,000. And the War Department's like, that's not good enough. Get ready for 10,000. So he is under this pressure to build a camp and prepare for the coming of these prisoners. And before the camp is even ready, prisoners begin to arrive in Hellmira in July of '64. Now, I should tell you that Seth Eastman is interesting for another reason. He is married to a lady named Mary Henderson, who is from Virginia, and she is what they call an FFB. You ever heard the term before, FFB? FFB stands for First Families of Virginia. She's from one of the first families of Virginia, which means that she's from Virginia aristocracy, right? Right up there with the Randolphs and the Lees. And so she's a proud Virginian. Her family has kept slaves in the past. But she's married to this Union Army officer. And of course, wherever he goes, she goes. They're married. But her heart is with Virginia, you see. Well, prior to the war, she got really, really angry when a very famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin became a New York Times bestseller, essentially, right? It was a hot book to read. Everybody wanted to read it. It sold a ton of copies, but it was controversial. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, had no idea that this book was going to sell the way that it did. And Lincoln thought it was so important that he once joked with her that she was the little lady that started this big war. That's how important this book was. Well, Mary Henderson was furious with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin is fiction, but Mary Henderson knew that Harriet Beecher Stowe knew nothing about slavery. You know, she was making a lot of this up. She probably never met an African American in her life. Mary Henderson wanted to tell the world what slavery was really like. And so she wrote her own version called Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, which did not sell very well, and it's hard to find a copy. I searched for a long time, and finally my daughter Quincy got me a copy. And when you read it, it's just propaganda defending the institution of slavery, talking about how good it is for the slaves and how humane a system it is, and you know, all of this defending the institution of slavery, but telling the story much like Harriet Beecher Stowe had, only with this Southern twist, right? So here she is in Hellmira with her husband, having written this book years ago, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. Now, Seth Eastman is the highest ranking Union officer in Hellmira, which places him at the top of Hellmira society, circulating kind of in the elite ranks, such as it was in Hellmira society. By the way, Hellmira at that time was a very liberal, progressive community, unlike it is today. Very, very liberal and progressive at this time. And so Seth Eastman and his wife Mary Henderson Eastman are circulating in Hellmira society, going to these parties and receptions among the elite. And there, also circulating, is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who summered in Hellmira because her brother was the pastor of the Park Church in Hellmira. Now, I haven't been able to find out, but wouldn't that be a conversation to hear? If these two ladies happen to run into each other, huh? You suppose that they're gonna want autographed copies of each other's books or something? That's a fly on the wall conversation, right? I would love to know if they ever met. Anyway, that's an interesting side story. We can move on from there. Now, this is the guy that really ran the camp day to day, Henry Colt. He was the commandant of the Hellmira POW camp. And so Seth Eastman is responsible for the whole Hellmira garrison, which is multiple camps, right? This guy is in charge just of the POW camp. He's from the famous Colt firearms family. He's also kind of on the injured reserve. So he had been fighting in Virginia. He got injured. And while he was recovering, they sent him to duty in Hellmira running this POW camp. And the reason that I find Colt so interesting is because of the way he is remembered by Confederate prisoners. Now, as I researched this book, I read many memoirs written by Confederate POWs. This was a real thing after the war. If you had been incarcerated somewhere, Andersonville or any place else, it became a thing to write your memoirs of incarceration. And so I read, 8 or 10 of these books written by former Hellmira prisoners. And they are filled with hate and vitriol, and they are just as dark and ugly as you might imagine. Complaining about the weather, complaining about the food, and just laying it on really thick. But what surprised me time and again was the way that they remembered this guy. Because while their books were filled with all this poison, they said he was just and kind. Several said that they loved him. And probably 8 out of the 10 mentioned him by name and said how just and fair and kind he was. This is their jailer that they're talking about, right? So this camp was so awful, and yet their jailer was a kind, just man that in fact they loved. I don't know, but something doesn't add up here in my mind, and I find this very curious. More evidence. When he returned to duty in January, I think it was, of 65, Confederate prisoners held a goodbye ceremony because they wanted to say goodbye formally to Colt, right? So they hold this ceremony to say goodbye to him, and they give him this gift of a chalice, a handmade chalice. The stem of it was intricately carved wood. The bowl of it was a coconut shell, half a coconut shell. Where they would have gotten a coconut in Hellmira, New York in 1868. This is not something that you would have been able to easily get. Yet that was the bowl, right, attached to the stem. They say it was carved and gorgeous. And they gave it to him on a solid silver platter. Literally, a solid silver platter. That's another question. Where are Confederate prisoners going to get a silver platter from? And yet they did, and they presented it to him in the ceremony, and they said that there were tears even at his parting. Their jailer. This is the guy that sometimes sentenced prisoners to be hung by their thumbs for some offense. And yet they loved him so much that they gave him this intricate parting gift. Isn't that something? And one of my theories here is that maybe things weren't quite as bad as they made out in their memoirs. Now, I'm not trying to apologize for anything, because I know the food was bad and it was cold, right, and they suffered. There's no doubt there was no suffering. There was a lot of suffering. Yet, you can't take, apparently, their memoirs quite so seriously, I don't think. My thought is, these guys, when they wrote their memoirs, were influenced by the controversy about Andersonville, and therefore were inspired to write about Hellmira, making their own contribution to this narrative. Does this make sense? So I think this is what's going on here. Anyway, Colt will return to duty and be well remembered. One of the prisoners, Anthony Kiley, formed such a close friendship that he and Colt will go into business with each other after the war. So this Confederate POW goes into business with Henry Colt in Richmond, Virginia after the war. What? So this is an artist's rendering of what the camp looked like. We believe, well, up until recently, we believed it was about 30 acres of land. Now, the Friends of Hellmira Prison are thinking that it might have been closer to 40 acres. In any case, you can see some interesting features here. You'll see that the back wall was right up against the Chemung River. I mean, right up against it. On the near side here, you see that Water Street runs along the opposite wall. Now, if you go to Hellmira today and you want to look around here, I have a guided tour as an appendix of the book, a driving tour, which is worth the price of the book, in my mind. Just $14 today, by the way. But the driving tour will take you up Water Street. You got to be careful, because Water Street suddenly turns into a one-way, kind of unexpectedly. But you'll see on Water Street Foster Mansion. If you're driving away from the city, Foster Mansion sits on Water Street on the right-hand side. It's a big white Georgian mansion. You can't miss it. It has twin chimney stacks. That mansion was there at the time. The Foster family, in fact, leased all that land to the federal government. If you see the Foster Mansion, the gate, the main gate to the prison would have been immediately opposite. So you can envision that while you're down there. So the main gate would have been here. The Foster Mansion would have been over here. They're going to put up tents and then barracks to hold the men. And I want to call your attention to this feature here. This is Foster's Pond. That was a point of controversy during the existence of this camp. Go to the next one. So this is an overlay of that map you just saw on the modern neighborhood. And so you can see that this is Water Street here. This is Foster's Pond here. And what I wanted to show you with this overlay is just how much of the modern neighborhood sat within the boundaries of the camp. And I know in the 1990s, when they put up that monument for the first time, there were many families in that neighborhood that had no idea their home sat on a former POW camp. This made it into the newspapers, interviews with these people who were shocked by this news. Go to the next one. So, Foster's Pond was an old still water pond used at the farm. And now it is right kind of smack dab in the middle of this camp. The reason this is notable is because when a health inspector from the War Department came just after the camp opened, he pointed to that as a point of problem. They had situated the latrines right along the bank of Foster's Pond. They would have been situated along here, but they did not site the vaults properly. So the urine and feces was getting into the pond and fouling the pond very badly. And the smell, apparently, just in a few weeks' time, became such a terrible stench. Now, the reason that this was thought to be a big problem is because medical science at that time suggested that this odor is what would make the Confederate prisoners sick. They called this miasmas. So the odors, they called miasmas. This would be inhaled by the prisoners and make them deathly ill. Now, we know today that this is not true, but at the time, that's what they believed. And so the logical thing to do then is to solve this problem if you really believe that this is going to make your prisoner sick, right? If you really care, and I guess that's the problem. They didn't really care, as we're going to see ultimately, because this problem is not going to go on to be solved, because Hoffman did not want to spend the money to solve the problem. Now, months later, deep in October, they will put prisoners to work running a slough so that there's fresh water running through this and it's not still water anymore. But it was kind of too little, too late kind of thing, using the prisoners to do the heavy labor, through the whole summer and into the fall, nothing was done. And it even reciting the latrines was not immediately done after this health inspector told them that it was a problem. And it was, a lot of this is simply because they're not highly motivated to spend the money or to do the effort because they think the war is almost over anyway. Now, Foster's Pond is a problem in a different way, though. But they did not understand bacteria at the time. Bacteria is the source of much disease, right? And the solution is antibiotics, but that's not going to come about until nearly World War I. If we had known about bacteria during the Civil War, we would have been able to save tens of thousands of lives. But we didn't. Now, the men that are incarcerated at this camp are not going to be drinking from Foster's Pond. So that's good at least. We do know that there were 4 wells that had been sunk, and they were sited very high on the camp. So they were well away from the pond, up near the city. And the water was very clear, and actually in many of the memoirs written by these Confederate prisoners, they talked about how delicious and wonderful the water was. So they had good drinking water that was not polluted. The problem is later. Prisoners are going to be eating muskrat out of this pond. Muskrats made their home in the mud on the edge of the pond. This is going to become a food source for these prisoners. Well, the bacteria is in the rats. And so it does become a problem later. Okay, we can move on from here. Let's not do this one. Let's move on from there, just for the sake of time. There is an interesting chapter at the end of the book on the Shahola train wreck. It was an early incident in the war, quite a tragedy. Another reason to buy the book. The POWs in Hellmira are going to be dying at the rate of hundreds a month sometimes. Many of them actually come to Hellmira broken down with disease. Many of them had dysentery when they arrived. Incarceration is not going to help their conditions at all. And those that die in Hellmira are going to be buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, Woodlawn Cemetery is where Mark Twain is buried today. among others. But they're going to build a plot special to Confederate POWs. And by the time that the camp is ended, nearly 3,000 will be interred in what will be eventually Woodlawn National Cemetery, which you can go visit today. Now, the chief surgeon of this camp was Sanger. He was brought in because you need to build hospitals and facilities to care for these men, in theory, right? Well, Sanger gets this job, and he's a very serious doctor, well respected. He's from Maine. The only problem is he's got this kind of personality where he's a little assertive, he's a little argumentative. He's not a terribly easy man to get along with, but he's a brilliant doctor, right? So he gets here to find that there are no proper hospital facilities. He doesn't have nearly the medicines that he needs. He walks into just a disaster. So he gets to work immediately, and he begins to requisition the authorities for more medicines and the supplies he needs, and nothing happens. And he can't understand why he's not getting what he needs. What he does not know is the War Department has no interest in supplying the needs of these Confederate prisoners. Because by now, and we're talking about the fall of '64 now, news about the POWs that were moved from Richmond down to Andersonville, especially those coming out of places like Belle Isle, where we have pictures in the Library of Congress that would startle of human skeletons, essentially, right? The War Department knows about these, and the War Department has begun now implementing policies that are retribution against Confederate POWs in our care. And in fact, over the course of the 1 year the Hellmira POW camp was in existence, July '64 to July '65, the War Department cut rations 3 times. 3 times. Did we have the food to properly feed these men? Oh yeah. I mean, Hellmira's surrounded by farms, right? That Confederate POWs should suffer scurvy in the midst of this plenty? That's ridiculous, right? But the War Department brought down these orders and cut rations 3 times to all POWs held by the Union in retribution for what was happening to our men. He did not know the full story. All he knew was he wasn't getting what he wanted, right? So he made the mistake of going over the head of camp authorities directly to the War Department. All right, so at the War Department, the Secretary of War is Edwin Stanton. Have you heard of this guy? All right, so Stanton was really good at his job, and he was a very efficient man, and he got stuff done. He knew how to get stuff done. But the way he got stuff done was through fear and intimidation. He is not a nice man. He's a bully, that's what he is. But even though he was this way, Lincoln kept him because he was so good at getting stuff done, right? Well, Stanton now has an out for the Confederacy, of course. And what he's learned about places like Andersonville and the other Confederate POW camps has made him bitter and angry. And so when Sanger appeals to the War Department for help, he's going right to Edwin Stanton and not kind of knowing he's poking the badger, you know? And soon Sanger disappeared, sacked, to be replaced by a man named Major Stocker, who comes in, makes no waves, files 1 report in his entire tenure in Hellmira, and makes do with whatever happens to be there. So Sanger is replaced by a yes man the War Department puts there just to stay quiet. Not to necessarily care properly for the Confederate prisoners, just to stay quiet. And this is reflected in another way, too. One more. we'll skip that one. This is the new post commander. So Seth Eastman, as I told you, he was not up to this job. He just wanted to play with his art, you know. And so he is going to take a leave of absence from the Army, and this guy comes in to replace him. Well, Benjamin Tracy is good friends with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. He's the kind of politician soldier that Grant and Sherman just despised. He's a New Yorker. He earned some distinction in battle. He'll even be awarded the Medal of Honor someday, though there's some evidence that could have been political. But he was kind of a lawyer and a politician that went to war, you know? And so when they decide they're going to replace Seth Eastman, the War Department sends this guy. And he's given his marching orders before he leaves Washington. And so that there is no mistake in his mind about what needs to be done in Hellmira. That's only going to lead to bad things for Confederate prisoners. So when these guys arrive in the summer of '64, the weather's very nice. The summer of '64, very pleasant temperatures, light breeze, you know, they're in the valley next to the water. And in the memoirs, and many of these Confederate prisoners, they talk about when they first arrived in Hellmira, how beautiful it was. Looking up at the hills and having the water nearby. And they talked in their early months about it was like camping. They were all intense. Now, the thing is, though, that winter sometimes comes early in the southern tier, as we all know, right? So what they should have done is they should have started building barracks before the men even arrived, in anticipation of the winter coming ultimately. But again, they don't, because they believe the war is going to be over before winter, so they don't even start building barracks until the fall of '64. And these barracks are made from green wood, which are going to split when they get cold. They are cheaply made. They're not all that much better than these tents, right? They are hurried construction made out of this green pine, and it's just going to be a disaster. There are going to be Confederate prisoners still in tents in January of '65. Still 100 men in tents in January '65. They don't get into barracks until late January. Snow was on the ground in October, and there were still nearly 1,000 men in tents at that point because of their poor planning. These guys are going to be sleeping on the frozen ground. If they have some straw, they would be lucky. And no matter where they're sleeping, everybody gets 2 blankets, that's it. You gotta remember, these Confederate prisoners, many of them are from the Deep South, right? They arrive in tatters. They don't have shoes. Almost none of them have shoes when they arrive. And what they get is 2 blankets, and that's what they're gonna have to get through the winter on. Now, the reconstructed barracks in Hellmira you can see today if you go down to visit, and these are quite historically accurate, but you'll see that it's just green pine. The berths, 2 men sleep to a berth, and you can see these windows, they're just on hinges, and when they close, there's gaps, right? There's no insulation in these at all. They'll get 2 coal stoves for each barracks. They'll be given a ration of coal, and that's got to last them 24 hours. So, you know, if it's really cold and they go through their supply in 12 hours, they're going to be really cold for the next 12 hours. That's just how it works. Why? And of course, typical Hellmira winter sets in. Now, because of a guy that lived in Hellmira, we know that there were 10 days during this winter that were below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. There were a number of blizzards over this winter, and these poor prisoners are going to be marched out for a roll call where they're going to stand sometimes knee deep in the snow, despite the fact that they have no shoes on, while roll call is taken. This bitter wind blowing through the valley, and can you just imagine them standing there with their blankets? held around them while they're waiting for this roll call to be completed, living on a sparse diet because they're not being fed properly, despite the fact that that could have easily been done. Go on. Move on here. So there were 2 meals furnished to Confederate prisoners a day, and they got meat once a day. They got a small chunk of beef in the morning with a biscuit, and their dinner was soup. It's very thin soup that was supposed to be made of beef or pork stock of some kind, and the authorities at Hellmira would say yes, but they could have seconds on the soup, you know. But there's no doubt about the fact that because rations kept being cut, the camp authorities themselves have got little control over what's being fed to these prisoners, despite the fact that they're living amidst plenty. We do know, in defense of camp authorities, that the supply chain for beef was very problematic because almost all beef was under contract with the Union Army, and it was being shuttled to places like Virginia, you know. So getting fresh beef in Hellmira was legitimately a problem. But there came to be this market in dressed rat. They would set up stalls literally inside the camp, and for 2 chews of tobacco, you could get a fresh dressed muskrat that you would then cook it and eat. And this is problematic because if it's not cooked all the way through, the bacteria in it's going to make you sick. We also know that a lot of local cats and dogs disappeared into the camp. They did have the benefit of religion. Harry Beecher Stowe's brother, Thomas Beecher, made it his duty to go in to preach to the ranks of the Confederate prisoners. But Confederate prisoners had a lot of problems with people like Beecher, because Beecher was an abolitionist. And he would take every opportunity, you know, to preach the way he saw the world. And that's not going to go over so well with the Mississippian, you know. But keeping busy, go on, was a very important part of surviving this. We know that a lot of these prisoners come in, they lose all hope, they become despondent, they stop eating eventually, and they're going to die. Incarceration really plays with your mind, both then and now. And if you can't keep busy, you can't keep your mind occupied, you're just going to wither away. So those that did best in Hellmira were the ones that found a way to keep busy. That might be hunting muskrats and selling them, right? Or many of them would put their talents to use making jewelry, carving chalices, maybe gardening. There was a beautiful garden near the headquarters at Hellmira, the prison. And these are some of the things made by the prisoners and then sold in the community. So the guards themselves were very important to this process because the guards would get them the supplies, they would make their wares, the guards would sell them in the community. Of course, the guards often got a cut of the action. But the money went into accounts that the prisoners had, the administration. They weren't allowed to keep cash. So any money earned went into these accounts, and when they're released later, then they're given the money. Legit, they were given their money out of these accounts when they left. But there was quite a few of these prisoners in Hellmira that made hundreds of dollars selling jewelry and such into the community. And it became a competition in Hellmira to get your hands on some of this stuff. So the citizens wanted this stuff too, so there was a demand. And by the way, so the last stop on the driving tour in here is the Chemung Valley History Museum, which I think everybody ought to see. It's on Water Street in Hellmira, and you can see artifacts from the camp there at this beautiful little museum, including things made by the prisoners. Okay? And this was the medium of exchange. North or south, it did not matter. That's what the currency was inside this camp. Now, the winter was just horrendous, and there was an awful lot of suffering. Tracy, the commandant, or the post commander, was told in the fall of '64, okay, now look, if you look up from the camp, you'll notice that you're in a bowl, surrounded by hills, just surrounded by hills, right? Covered with snow in the winter. And so Tracy is told, when the spring comes and that snow on those hills melts, it all goes into the river. And this river is going to come booming down through this valley, so you'd better get ready. Tracy does nothing. And the result is, in March of '65, there were 3 days of unusually warm weather. The snow all melted, and there's a flood so bad that all of the city of Hellmira was underwater. The whole city was underwater. The whole camp, of course, then was underwater, either 8 feet underwater or 6 inches underwater. It was sloping ground on the river. And in the first minutes of the flood, 80% of the palisade is just washed away. Interestingly, nobody escaped. Of course, where are you going to go, right? You're going to swim your way to freedom, right? It was something of a problem. There were no escapes, and thankfully, there was only one casualty. One of the emergencies that occurred at this time was that when this all was washed away and the flood came, the smallpox hospital was on this little knoll down by the river, and they had to be rescued. Now, of course, smallpox patients were kept away from the rest of the population, right? They were a little bit lucky that they were on higher ground down there in that one spot. But in the middle of the night, this was St. Patrick's Day, 1865, they had to jury-rig these rafts with tow ropes. And guards and prisoners side by side working together in the emergency to try to rescue the smallpox patients. And they were all rescued but one who fell into the water, which was very icy. There was big chunks of ice, in the water, and he's going to die later because of exposure. But the rest of them survived. I don't know if they survived the smallpox, but they survived this operation. But it's really quite a miracle that there was not, worse suffering from this. But by this time, March of '65, the camp had begun the process of emptying out. So even before the spring campaign, the Appomattox campaign, which leads to Lee's surrender ultimately in April, even before that campaign opened, Grant started prisoner exchanges again. Because he could see the writing on the wall, from February of '65. Lee's army was starving. He knew it was just a matter of time. And so the first prisoners began leaving in February. The rate of departure really steps up in March. And by the end of June, almost all have left Hellmira. Interestingly, these men that are being released are not being escorted. They are released, and they are given a railroad pass to take them wherever they live. It's a free railroad pass throughout the country. And they're given rations, and they're on their own to get home, And they all were given money if they had money in their accounts at the camp. Dozens of these guys hang around Hellmira for as much as 2 weeks, going to the restaurants and the hotels and touring the area and taking souvenirs even, and kind of leisurely making their way home. We know that a lot of these businesses were shocked that these POWs were coming in, buying new clothes, eating at the restaurants, lingering. And there were a number of them that stayed. There were a number of them that just decided never to go home. One of the escapees, in fact, is a really good escape story in one of the appendices here. One of the guys, instead of going south, went north and made his home north of Corning for the rest of his life, with his 8 neighbors never knowing that he was a former Confederate that had been incarcerated in Hellmira. So again, it makes you wonder, how bad was it really if you want to stay here? If you're in no hurry to leave, right? It makes you wonder about those memoirs. Move on. Now, I told you that soon after the war, they sold off the buildings. They're going to return this to farmland as if there was nothing ever here. There were no physical reminders but one, the old dead house. So a neighbor, when the buildings were sold off, bought the morgue and made it into a garage. And at the turn of the century, that was the one former camp building that could still be identified. And they used to say the school children would walk by and talk about it, the dead house from the prison, you see. So this was kind of the one physical reminder that still existed into the 20th century. Now, if you could go there today, you can see the restored building. That was we think it was a commissary building from original lumber. And I hope that someday you will go to Woodlawn National Cemetery, to the Confederate section. Nearly 3,000 Confederate POWs still lie there. And this wonderful monument to their memory. Okay, that's that. So let me just wrap up then. So nearly 10,000 men are going to be incarcerated in Hellmira ultimately. The casualty rate is 25% in Hellmira, which made it the highest casualty rate of any POW camp run by the Union. Really, the only comparison with Andersonville is that death rate. When you think about it, Andersonville was 30%. Hellmira was 25%. Most other ways, they're not really comparable. But the point really is both sides should have done better. The casualties in all POW camps exceeded 50,000, the size of an army. And there is no reason why this needed to happen. And I look at this and I say, this is just a humanitarian disaster that should have been avoided. We should have risen above the need for retribution and treated these people as human, right? In my mind. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much for coming. If you want to buy a copy of the book, that would be wonderful. They're $14 each.